I'm Maren Holt, 42, and I enlisted in the Marine Corps at 19 with nothing to my name but a stubborn streak and a good aim. For 15 years, I carried the memory of 8 Marines who did not come home from a road we were ordered to keep open, and I carried it quietly in the back of every room so that no one would ever look at me too closely. But when a young sergeant knocked the cover off my head at their memorial and the presiding general saw what was hidden beneath my collar, I finally had to decide whether I would keep hiding or let myself be seen. Have you ever been looked straight through by people who had no idea who you really were? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you are tuning in from. And if you have ever had to hold on to your dignity while someone underestimated everything you had given, hit that like button and subscribe. It was the kind of drive that should have felt like nothing. 2 hours of coastal highway I had done 100 times, and twice I nearly turned the car around. I have stood in front of gunfire and not flinched. It was a slab of granite with 8 names on it that made my hands shake on the wheel. The uniform was on a hanger in the back seat, pressed and ready, the way I had kept it for 15 years. I was in civilian clothes for the drive, a plain jacket and jeans, a woman anyone would take for someone's tired aunt heading to a family thing. That was mostly how I liked it. For 15 years, I had made a study of being unremarkable, of being the quiet one in the corner of the room who carried her own bags and asked for nothing. And it had worked. People let you alone when you give them no reason to look twice. The drive matters because everything that happened the next day only makes sense if you understand the person behind that wheel. I was not a woman going to be honored. I was the survivor going to stand in front of the names of the people who did not survive. And there's no medal in the world that makes that an easy thing to do. 15 years earlier, I was a sergeant, 27 years old, on a female engagement team attached to a rifle company in Helmand Province. If you do not know what that was, I will tell you the way I used to tell the new lieutenants who did not know what to do with us. In that valley, no man in an American uniform could sit in a room with an Afghan woman. It was not allowed, not by them and not by us, and so half of the human terrain in every village was invisible to the rifle squads. We were the ones who could sit in those rooms. We drank the tea, we held the children. We learned who was frightened and who was lying and who had a son who had gone up into the hills with a rifle. It was quiet work, and it was dangerous work, and the infantry did not quite know where to put 2 women in their formation. I had come up the hard way to get there. I enlisted at 19, and the man who made a Marine out of me was an old master gunnery sergeant named Otis Trelawney, who had a face like a dropped map and no patience for anyone who felt sorry for themselves. He told me once that the Marine Corps did not owe me a place, that I would have to be twice as steady as the man next to me to be given half the room, and that if that made me angry, I was welcome to leave. It did not make me angry. It made me steady. I have him to thank for the fact that I never once let that valley see me rattled. The first man in the company who treated me like a Marine instead of a problem was a corporal named Rafe Sisto. He was 24, from a town in the middle of the country I could never remember the name of. And he had a way of making everything sound simple. The company had assigned him to walk with our team, to be our security, and I could tell he had expected it to be a punishment. On the second day, he watched me carry my own water and my own gear up a wadi that had put 2 of his buddies on their knees, and he watched me put 5 rounds into a paper target the size of a hand, at a distance most of them missed clean. "You carry your own water and you shoot straight," he said. "Far as I'm concerned, that's the whole job." I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count. It was the first time in that deployment anyone had told me I belonged. The work went on like that for months. I would go into the compounds with my interpreter, a patient woman named Soraya, who had more courage than half the battalion, and Rafe would set himself in a doorway where he could see me and the street both, and he would make himself into a wall between me and the valley so that I could do the thing only I could do. I would come out of a compound with the location of a weapons cache or the name of a man laying charges on the road. Information no rifle squad could ever have gotten, and Rafe would just nod, of course, like that was the whole point of me being there, which it was. There was a little girl in one of the villages, 6 or 7 years old, who used to run out to meet us at the edge of her family's compound, and she would take my hand and walk me in like I was a visiting aunt. Her mother told Soraya things over the course of a month that saved a patrol from a culvert bomb, and she told them because a woman had sat on her floor and held her daughter and drunk her tea and treated her like a person instead of a threat. I have carried that little girl in my mind for 15 years too, along with the 8, because she was the reason the work mattered. The proof that 2 women in a formation could reach a corner of that war that all the rifles in the province could not. Rafe used to stand in the doorway of that compound and pretend to scowl at the girl until she laughed. He was gentle in a way that the valley did everything it could to burn out of a man, and it never managed it with him. I gave that team my steadiness. I never let them see me shaken, not once, because I understood that 2 women in that formation could not afford a single bad day. And in return, they gave me something I had been looking for since I raised my right hand at 19 years old. They gave me a place where I belonged completely, without an asterisk, without having to explain myself. You spend your whole life looking for a room like that. Most people never find one. I found mine in the worst valley in the world, surrounded by men who would not live to see me become a major. That night before the dedication, I checked into the base lodging, a plain room with a hard bed, and I laid the uniform out flat the way I always did. I looked at the ribbons for a long time. There's a small one at the top of the rack, pale blue, and I have never in 15 years worn it anywhere a stranger might see it and ask. I laid the cover on the pillow, squared it out of habit, and turned off the light. I told myself I would stand in the back. I told myself I would read the names and leave before anyone made a fuss. I have made a lot of plans in my life that did not survive contact. A ceremony like the one they were putting on the next morning is a machine, and like every machine, it is run by people who mistake the running of it for the meaning of it. I got there early, in my service uniform now, the green coat and the cover, and I found a place near the front where the wall stood under a gray shroud waiting to be revealed. I could have gone to the reserved section. I had a card in my pocket that would have put me in the front row with the families and the general officers. I did not use it. I stood at the rope, where anyone could stand, 3 feet from the granite, close enough that when the cloth came down, I would be able to read the names without my glasses. The cordon detail was forming up around me, young Marines in their dress uniforms, and I watched them the way you watch anyone doing a job you used to do. There was a sergeant running the front rope, like a man who had decided the whole event was his to manage. His name, I would learn, was Cody Wexler. He was 25, crisp as a folded flag, and he had the particular confidence of a Marine who has never once been shot at. I do not say that as an insult. Every one of us started there. But his ribbons told the whole story. There was nothing on his chest that had cost him anything yet, and he wore the certainty of a man who did not know that yet. The detail's staff non-commissioned officer was a gunnery sergeant named Dermot Pruitt, 41, thick through the shoulders, with the flat voice of a man who has given the same brief 1,000 times. He gathered his Marines in close and told them to keep the reserved rows clear for the VIPs and the Gold Star families, to be firm but respectful, to remember that the cameras would be running. His eyes passed over me the way water passes over a stone. I had learned a long time ago that a quiet woman in a plain green uniform is invisible to a certain kind of man in a hurry. I did not take it personally. I had spent 15 years being invisible on purpose, and I was good at it, and there is a strange loneliness in being good at a thing you taught yourself out of grief. I watched the families come in while the detail fussed with the ropes. You can always tell the Gold Star families at a thing like that, and it has nothing to do with the small pins some of them wear. It is in the way they walk, a little slower than everyone else, saving themselves for the wall. There was an old woman who came in on the arm of a grandson in his church clothes, and a father in a suit that no longer fit him, carrying a framed photograph against his chest, and a young widow, younger than I had been in the valley, with 2 children who did not remember the man whose name they had come to read. I knew standing there that I had a card in my pocket that would seat me among them, and I knew I would not use it because it felt like stealing a chair from someone who had lost more than I had. That was the arithmetic I had been running for 15 years, and I ran it again at that rope without even noticing I was doing it. Their grief was bigger than mine. I would stand in the back. I would take up no room. I want to take you back to that last week in the valley, because the warning signs in both of my timelines are the same shape. And I did not see it until much later. That last week, the patrols along the canal road started drawing fire. Not much at first, a single shot from a tree line. A burst that went high, the kind of thing a young Marine talks himself out of worrying about on the walk back to the wire. But Rafe felt it, and I felt it. We had both spent enough months in that place to know when a road was turning against us, when the children stopped coming out to wave and the compounds went quiet a day before you passed them. I reported it up. I sat with the company commander and I told him the canal road felt wrong, and I gave him the specific reasons, the empty markets, the men who would not meet my eyes, the boy who had told Soraya to stay off the road on Thursday. And the answer that came back down was the answer that always comes down when the people on the ground and the people on the map disagree. The road stays open. Keep the road open. There was a resupply that had to move and a schedule that had to hold, and the valley did not care about either one. Back in the present, standing at that rope, I felt a small hand of memory on my shoulder, because I could see the same machine running. Everyone in that garden was busy managing the wrong emergency. The protocol officer was worried about the microphone. Pruitt was worried about the rouse. Wexler was worried about the rope. And the actual reason we were all there, 8 men who had kept a road open with their bodies, waited quietly under a gray cloth, while grown professionals fussed about the placement of the folding chairs. There was one young Marine on the detail who was not like the others. A lance corporal, maybe 21, a kid named Emmett Foss. He kept glancing at the ribbons on my chest and then away and then back, and I could see him doing the math that no one else in that garden was doing. He was young, but he was the kind of young Marine who reads, who knows what the pale blue means when he sees it. I watched him work up the nerve to say something to me, take half a step in my direction, and I watched Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt tell him to get back on the rope before he could get a word out. The warning went unheard. In that garden and in that valley, both, the people who could feel the truth coming were told to get back in line. The crowd thickened as the hour came on. Families in their good clothes, old veterans with unit ball caps, a color guard assembling off to one side. I held my place at the rope, 3 feet from the shrouded wall, and I did not move, because I had come 2 hours and 15 years to read those names up close, and I was not going to read them from the back of a crowd. That was when Sergeant Wexler reached me. He came down the rope, clearing space, moving people back with the flat authority of a man who has confused a lanyard for a commission. And he got to me, and he did not look at my collar. He did not look at my face. Not really. He looked at the space I was taking up. The 3 feet of grass between me and the granite that his diagram said should be empty. Behind the line, Marine, he said. Family and VIPs only up front. Let's move. I told him, quietly, that I belonged there. I told him I had known the men on that wall. I did not say it as a challenge. I said it the way you tell someone a true thing you expect them to accept, with no heat in it. But he heard only a woman who would not do what she was told, and to a certain kind of young sergeant on a big day, with cameras running and a gunnery sergeant watching, that is the only emergency in the world. Family waits in the back, he said, louder now, so the people nearby could hear him handling it. I will not tell you again. And he put his hand on my shoulder and he shoved me back a step. It was not a huge thing. It was the kind of shove a man gives when he has stopped seeing a person and started seeing an obstacle, more push than blow. But his forearm came up as he pushed, and it caught the brim of my cover, and it knocked it clean off my head and onto the grass. The cover hit the grass at my feet. A few people turned to look. I felt every one of those years land on me at once. I want to be honest with you about what went through me in that second, because it was not what you might think. It was not rage. It was a terrible, familiar smallness. The exact feeling I had spent 15 years arranging my whole life to avoid. The feeling of being the woman no one thinks to look at twice, standing in front of the names of men who had looked at me and seen a Marine. There is a particular grief in being made invisible in front of the only people who ever truly saw you, even when those people are 8 names under a gray cloth. Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt arrived then. He saw a graying detail problem, a woman making a scene at the rope on a day with cameras, and he did the easy thing, which is the thing that ruins more good order and discipline than any enemy ever has. He backed his sergeant without checking a single fact. Ma'am, you need to comply and step to the rear, Pruitt said. Don't make this a scene on today of all days. I did not argue. I have never in my life won an argument by having it in front of a crowd, and I did not intend to start at a memorial for my friends. There's a kind of strength that looks exactly like surrender from the outside, and I had learned the difference a long time ago. I bent down. I reached into the wet grass, and I picked up my cover, and I brushed the damp from the brim with my thumb the way you do without thinking, the way a Marine has done 10,000 times. And as I straightened up, the collar of my service coat fell open just enough. Just enough that the top of the ribbon rack caught the morning light. Just enough that a man standing on the dais 40 feet away, A man in the middle of a sentence to the chaplain saw a small band of pale blue and a line of tiny white stars against the green of my coat. He stopped talking. He went very still, and on a dais above a garden full of people fussing about folding chairs, Major General Ambrose Farrow forgot how to breathe. For a moment, nothing happened, and that moment is the one I remember most clearly of the whole day. The general on the dais had gone rigid, and no one around him understood why. The chaplain looked at him, waiting for the end of the sentence that did not come. The protocol officer looked at his clipboard, and then at the general, and then at his clipboard again, as though the schedule might explain it. And then Major General Farrow stepped away from the microphone, and he came down the dais steps, one hand on the rail, and he started across the grass toward the rope. The crowd quieted, the way a crowd does when it senses something without knowing what. A hush that starts near the front and moves outward. Wexler, standing over me, with the last of his order still in his mouth, saw the general coming and squared himself up, and I could see exactly what he thought was happening. He thought the general was coming to back him. He thought a 2-star officer was crossing a memorial garden to help him remove a difficult woman from the rope. He had no idea. He stood a little straighter, lifted his chin, ready to be thanked for his diligence. Let me take you to the morning it happened, because you cannot understand what General Farrow was walking toward until you have stood where he was standing 15 years before. The Canal Road ambush came the way the bad ones always come, all at once and from everywhere. The lead vehicle went up on a buried charge, a sound you feel in your teeth before you hear it. And before the echo had finished rolling off the hills, the tree lines on both sides opened up, and the squad was caught in the open, on a raised road, with ditches on either side, and no cover worth the name. I was not supposed to be in that fight. I was an attachment. My job was the tea and the compounds and the human terrain, and by every line on every chart, I should have been in the rear of that patrol with Soraya, well back from the point. But I was not in the rear. I was near the front, because Rafe had a bad feeling about that road, and had kept me close. Close enough that when the world came apart, I was inside it. And when it did come apart, I did the only arithmetic that made any sense to me. The wounded were in the open on the road. The guns were on the tree lines. And the only thing between the two was the width of a body. And I had a body and a rifle, and 11 years of Otis Trelawney in my spine telling me to be steady. I did not decide to be brave. I want to be exact about that, because people hear the word hero, and they imagine a decision, a jaw set against fear, and it was nothing like that. I decided that no one else was going to die in that ditch if I could put my body between them and the road. That was the whole of it. I got a rifle up, and I made the near tree line keep its head down with steady, aimed fire, and I grabbed the drag handle on the back of a Marine's armor, and I hauled him down off the road into the ditch, and then I climbed back up and went for the next one, and the next. My hearing went to a high ringing, and the world narrowed to the next handle, the next 20 feet, the next breath. The first one I pulled off the road was a lance corporal named Diaz, who had taken rounds through both legs, and he kept trying to help me drag himself, kept apologizing, and I told him to shut up and let me work, and he lived. The second was a private I barely knew who had been thrown clear of the lead vehicle and had a broken arm and no rifle, and I put him behind me in the ditch and told him to keep pressure on the man beside him, gave him a job so his hands would stop shaking, and he lived. Those 2 men are somewhere in this country right now, grown older, and I would not know them if they passed me in a store, and that is exactly as it should be. They do not owe me anything. I have never wanted them to know my name. I only wanted them to have the years, and they have the years. And on the bad nights, that is the one piece of arithmetic that comes out even. Rafe was pulling a younger Marine clear when he was hit. I got to him as fast as a person can move across open ground, with rounds cracking past like the air itself was tearing, and I turned him over, and he was already gone. There was no last word. There is almost never a last word, whatever the movies tell you. There is just a man who is making everything simple 1 minute and is gone the next, and no time at all to understand it, because the wounded were still behind me and the guns were still on the tree line. I held that position anyway. I want you to understand that I did not hold it out of courage either. I held it because the wounded were behind me, and if I left, they died, and it was that plain. I held it, and I kept the near tree line down until the quick reaction force came grinding up the road and the guns finally went quiet. When it was over, 4 Marines were alive who would not have been, and 8 of us were not coming home. Rafe was one of the 8. Back in the present, in the garden, Major General Farrow stopped a few feet from me. And now you know what he was looking at. He had commanded that battalion. Those were his Marines on that wall and his Marines in that ditch. And the woman his sergeant had just shoved into the grass was the reason 4 families got their sons back instead of 6 more folded flags. General Farrow stood in front of me, and for a long second neither of us said anything, because there was 15 years in the space between us and no quick way across it. I could see him aging in reverse as he looked at me, could see the lieutenant colonel he had been surfacing under the 2 stars, the man who had stood at the ramp of a transport plane and saluted 8 cases draped in flags. Then he did the thing that turned the whole garden around. He came to attention. A major general, 58 years old, 2 silver stars on each shoulder, came to attention in front of a major, standing in the grass, with her cover in her hands, and he brought his hand up in a slow salute, and he held it. "Sergeant Wexler," he said, and his voice was very quiet, and it carried anyway, the way a quiet voice does when everyone has already stopped talking. "Step back from her, now!" Wexler did not understand yet. He took a half step back out of pure reflex, the way you obey a general before you have finished being confused by him, his face still caught somewhere between pride and the first cold edge of doubt. Then Farrow turned his head, just enough to speak to the formation, and he said the thing that rearranged the morning. "You will render honors. This is Major Holt. She wears the Medal of Honor. I have been in loud rooms and quiet rooms, but I have never heard a silence move through a crowd the way that one did. It went out from the general like a ring in water. The cordon Marines came to attention, one after another, down the rope. A wave of it, spines snapping straight. The families in the front row turned in their seats. An old veteran in a unit ball cap near the aisle got slowly to his feet, and then the man next to him, and then the whole row. And Sergeant Cody Wexler went the color of the shroud on the wall as he understood, all at once, what he had done and to whom he had done it. He had shoved a Medal of Honor recipient. He had put his hands on her and knocked the cover off her head, at a memorial in front of a 2-star general and 8 gold star families. He had done it to the one person in that entire garden the ceremony most existed to honor. I did not feel triumphant. I want to be truthful with you, because I think the truth is the only thing here worth your time. I did not feel a flush of victory, no warm rush of vindication, none of the things you might hope to feel when the person who wronged you learns exactly how wrong they were. I felt like I had been made visible, against my will. On the one day, I had come specifically to disappear into a crowd. Every eye in that place was on me now, and the pale blue ribbon I had hidden for 15 years was doing exactly the thing I had spent 15 years making sure it would never do. It was making the day about me, and the day was not supposed to be about me. The day was supposed to be about 8 men under a gray cloth. Off to the side, Lance Corporal Foss, the young Marine who had tried to speak up and been told to get back on the rope, had tears standing in his eyes, and he was at a rigid, trembling attention, and I understood that he was not crying for me. He was crying because he had known. He had read the ribbon and known, and no one had let him say it. And now he was watching what his silence had helped allow. In the front row, the young widow with the 2 children had a hand pressed over her mouth, and the old woman on her grandson's arm had begun, very quietly, to cry, though I do not think she fully understood yet what she was crying about, only that something true had just happened in a morning full of arranged things. The father, in the too small suit, had lowered his framed photograph and was looking at me over the top of it. And there was a question in his face that I would spend the rest of the day answering for one family after another, the same question every time, which was simply, "Did you know him?" Standing there with my cover back in my hands, I understood that my 15 years of hiding had not only been about me. Every one of those families had spent 15 years wondering whether their son had died among strangers or among people who loved him. And I was one of the only people left alive who could tell them the answer, and I had been hiding from them too. That was the moment the hiding started to feel less like humility and more like a debt of a different kind. General Farrow finished his salute and lowered his hand and looked at Wexler with an expression I had seen on a lot of commanders over the years. the look of a man deciding a young Marine's future in real time. "I can have this sergeant removed from the detail," Pharaoh said to me, low, just between the two of us. "Relieved on the spot. One word from you, Major, and it is done." And there it was, handed to me in front of everyone. The word. All I had to do was say it, one syllable, and the young man who had shoved me into the grass would spend the rest of the day, and very likely a good deal longer, paying for the worst 30 seconds of his career. I told the general no. I told him that if we started this day by ending a young Marine's career, we would be honoring the wrong thing entirely. I said it quietly, but I said it plainly so that there would be no mistaking it for weakness, because mercy that looks like weakness helps no one. Then I lifted my cover, and I put it back on my own head, and I squared it with 2 fingers, the way I have squared it 10,000 times. And I asked the general if we could please continue, because the families had waited 15 years, and they should not have to wait another minute on account of me. They continued. General Pharaoh went back to the dais, though he walked backward a step or two first, the way you do when you are not quite ready to turn away from something, and the chaplain found his place again and said his words, and then the moment came that we had all traveled so far to reach. 2 Marines took the corners of the gray shroud, and at a word they drew it down, and the cloth pooled on the grass, and the wall stood bare in the morning light, with 8 names cut deep into the granite. I found his near the top. Sisto, Rafe, Corporal. I read each of the 8 the way I once accounted for each Marine after contact, out loud in my head, one at a time, present and accounted for, except that none of them were present and all of them were accounted for in the only way that was left to us. I did not fall apart. I want you to know that it is possible to stand in front of the worst thing in your life and not fall apart. Not because you are strong, but because you have carried it so long that your arms have simply learned the shape of it. Grief does not always look like weeping. Sometimes it looks like a woman standing very still, reading 8 names she already knows by heart. A rifle detail fired 3 volleys, and the flat cracks rolled off the far buildings. And then a lone bugler somewhere behind the wall played taps, and every note of it walked up my spine. I have heard taps more times than I can count, at more funerals than a person should attend in one life. And it has never once gotten easier. And I have decided it is not supposed to. When the last note faded, the garden was so quiet you could hear the flags moving on their poles. I stood there in that quiet, and I said the 8 names to myself one more time, slowly. And I let each one be a whole person for a moment instead of a letter cut in stone. Ramirez, who sang badly and constantly. Okonkwo, who was going to be an engineer. Bell, who had a baby he never met. And Sisto, near the top, who carried his own water and made everything simple, and who would have hated every second of a ceremony this size, and would have stood through all of it anyway for the others. Let me tell you about the day they gave me the medal, because it is the reason I had spent 15 years hiding it. It was 2 years after the Valley. I stood at attention in a room with a great deal of gold on the walls and a great many important people in it, while a man read a citation out loud, and every word of that citation was true, and I hated every word of it. I hated it because it had been purchased with my friends, and it seemed to me an obscene kind of arithmetic that 8 men should die and I should get a ribbon for the surviving of it. When they put the medal around my neck, I felt the weight of it like a hand, and I thought, this is not an award, this is a bill, and it will come due every day for the rest of my life. I decided that day, standing there under all that gold, that I would never trade on it. That I would never let it open a door or clear a room or make a stranger treat me as more than I was. I would carry it the way you carry a debt, quietly, privately, and I would never once let it make my own life easier, because my friends did not get to have easier lives. That decision is a big part of why I am telling you this at all, because it took a sergeant knocking my cover into the grass to show me that I had turned a debt into a hiding place, and that there is a difference. That is why I had stood at the rope instead of the front row. That is why the ribbon was hidden under a collar, That is why a sergeant could knock my cover into the grass and never once suspect he had put his hands on a recipient, because I had spent 15 years making very sure that no one ever would. At the reception afterward, in a hall off the garden with coffee urns and folding tables, Gunnery Sergeant Pruitt came to find me. He came stiff and gray in the face, a senior non-commissioned officer who had backed the wrong Marine in front of a general in a crowd, and he stood in front of me at a careful position of attention, and he apologized. It was a real apology, not a smooth one, and the real ones are always a little clumsy. He said he had not looked. He said he had spent 20 years telling young Marines to look at everything, to read the whole situation before they acted, and he had walked up to the one situation in that garden that demanded it and had not looked at all. I told him the thing that mattered was not the apology. I told him that the whole job, the entire job of a leader, is learning to look at the quiet ones, because the loud problem at the rope is almost never the important thing in the room. He took it the way a good Marine takes a hard correction, which is to say he did not argue, and he did not crumble, and he did not make excuses. He said, "Yes, ma'am," and he meant it, and I believed him. And that was the end of it, between us. Across the hall, meanwhile, I watched Sergeant Wexler stand alone at the very edge of the garden, where the grass met the trees. He could not look at me. He had the specific, drowning misery of a young man who has just discovered that the thing he thought he had completely mastered, he did not understand at all. I could have left him there. It would have been the easy thing, and no one in that garden, not the general, not the families, not Pruitt, would have thought a moment less of me for it. A woman who has been shoved into the grass at her friend's memorial is owed her distance, and more than her distance. But I have buried men who did not get the chance to become better than their worst morning, men whose whole lives got frozen at 24, and I have never once in the years since been able to walk past a young Marine drowning in a mistake without throwing him something. It is not that I am kind. It is that I know exactly what it is worth to be given another day, because I know exactly what it cost the 8 who were not. So I crossed the garden to Sergeant Wexler. He saw me coming and he braced. The way you brace for a wave you can see building and know is going to knock you flat. He was already standing at something close to attention before I reached him, his jaw tight, and I could tell he had spent the last half hour building the reckoning in his head, rehearsing it, and that whatever he had built was worse than anything I had come to say. I did not give him the reckoning he was braced for. I asked him a question instead. I asked him if he knew any of the names on the wall. He said no. He said it quietly, and the not knowing shamed him more in that moment than the shoving had. I could see it. He had spent all morning guarding a wall, and he had never once read it. So I told him about one of them, not the ambush, not the medal. I told him about Rafe Sisto, the man, because the lesson is cheap and the person is not. I told him about a corporal from a town in the middle of the country whose name I could never remember, who carried his own water and made everything sound simple, who set himself in doorways so that 2 women could do a job no man in the valley could do, who looked at me on the second day of the worst deployment of my life and told me that if you carry your own water and you shoot straight, that is the whole job. I told him Rafe had been 24, that he would have been 39 now, that he had a laugh you could find in a crowd. I gave Wexler the person, the whole living weight of him, and I watched it land. "How do you stand there and not hate me?" he said finally, and his voice cracked on the last word. "I put my hands on you, at their memorial, in front of everybody." I told him I had buried better men than the version of himself he had been an hour ago at that rope, and that I did not have any hate to spare for a young Marine who could still be taught. I told him he did not owe me an apology, that apologies are cheap and easy and cost the person nothing. I told him he owed them, the 8, a better career than the one he had nearly started that morning at the rope. And I told him the way you pay a debt like that is not with words, and not in a day. You pay it with 30 years of looking twice. You pay it with every quiet person you take the trouble to actually see. And then I gave him something to do, because a young man drowning in shame needs a rope thrown to him, not a speech shouted from the shore. I told him there were 8 families in that garden, and that some of them had come alone, a mother here, an old father there, and that I wanted his help walking each one of them to the wall, so that no Gold Star parent had to stand at the back of a crowd and find their child's name by themselves. He took it like a lifeline, with something close to gratitude in his face. And for the next hour, I watched Sergeant Cody Wexler walk grieving strangers across the grass to the granite, one at a time, slow and steady and gentle, bending to hear them, standing with them while they touched the letters. I watched a young Marine begin to become the thing he had only been play-acting that morning at the rope. I walked one of them to the wall myself. It was the old woman who had come in on her grandson's arm, and she was Ramirez's mother, the one who sang badly and constantly. And when I told her that her son had filled the back of every truck in the valley with terrible, cheerful singing until even the men who told him to knock it off were smiling, she gripped my arm hard enough to bruise, and she said, "That was my boy. That was exactly my boy. He got it from his father." We stood in front of his name for a long time. She did not want to be told he was a hero. She had been told that 100 times by people who never knew him, and it had stopped meaning anything years ago. What she wanted was to know that he had been himself out there, all the way to the end, that the valley had not taken the singing boy and turned him into someone she would not recognize. I could give her that. It was the one thing I had that was worth more than the ribbon under my collar, and it had been sitting locked in me for 15 years while she wondered. When we walked back, she was lighter on her grandson's arm than she had been coming in. I've thought about that too on the drive home and many times since. How a thing that cost me nothing to give had been the thing she needed most in the world, and how close I had come to carrying it to my own grave, rather than let anyone see me. General Farrow found me after the reception had thinned, when the light had gone long and gold across the garden, and most of the folding chairs sat empty in crooked rows. He was not my commander anymore. He was an old battalion commander standing in front of the Marine who had saved what was left of his battalion, and there is no rank structure in the world that governs a conversation like that one. We were just two people who had been in the same valley on the same terrible morning, standing in a quiet garden 15 years later, both of us a little amazed to still be here. "I have signed a great many letters to families, Major," he said. "More than any man should have to. And yours is the one hand I have wanted to shake for 15 years and never once been able to find." He told me he had seen the ribbon before he saw my face. He told me that for one full second on the dais, before his mind caught up to his eyes, he had genuinely thought he was looking at a ghost from the canal road, that his heart had simply stopped. We stood there in the gold light, and we talked about the 8 of them, by name one after another, which is a thing you can almost never do in your life, because almost no one else you meet ever knew them. And here in front of me was a man who had known every single one, who had written to every one of their mothers. Then he asked me the question I'd been avoiding from every direction for 15 years. He asked me why I never wore the medal, why I never spoke about it, never let anyone put me on a stage, never let a stranger say the words to me. Why I had stood at the rope that morning like an ordinary Marine and let a sergeant knock my cover into the grass rather than say 3 words that would have stopped the whole thing cold. I gave him the honest answer because he had earned it and because I was tired. Tired in a way that 15 years will make you. I told him I had been afraid that if I ever let myself accept the thanks, if I ever wore the ribbon out where people could see it and say the words to me and mean them, it would mean I had made my peace with the price. And I was not ready to make my peace with the price. I told him I did not know if I ever would be, that some mornings I still woke up on the canal road, that the arithmetic still made no sense to me, 8 of them in one ribbon, and me still breathing. General Farrow was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing I have carried home from that garden and turned over in my hands every single day since. "The wall is not the price, Major," he said. "The wall is the receipt. The price was paid in the valley, by them, once, and it is paid. You have been trying to pay it again every day for 15 years, out of your own pocket, and it does not work that way. It was never yours to pay. You do not owe it twice." I did not have an answer for him. There are some things that are simply too true to answer in the moment, that you can only stand there and let hit you. But I felt something come loose in my chest that had been fixed so tightly in place for so long that I had genuinely stopped noticing it was there, the way you stop hearing a sound that never stops. He was telling me I was allowed to set it down. I did not know yet whether I could. But for the first time in 15 years, a man I trusted completely, a man who had been in that valley and knew the exact weight of what I carried, had told me plainly that I was allowed to try. Before he left, General Farrow told me one more thing, and he told it to me plainly, the way he had told me everything. He said that in 34 years of service, he had learned that the Corps does not always know how to honor the people who most deserve it, that the machinery of a day like this one is clumsy and loud and gets the wrong things right, and that the truest honors he had ever witnessed had happened exactly the way mine had that morning, by accident, in the grass, when no one had planned for them. He said the sergeant who knocked my cover off had, without meaning to, given the day the only unrehearsed, true moment it was ever going to have. Then he said that he was going to put me in for nothing, request nothing of me, schedule nothing, because he understood now that the kindest thing he could do for me was to let me remain exactly as visible or invisible as I chose. And then he asked, only, that whatever I choose it on purpose from here forward, and not out of hiding. He shook my hand, both of his around mine, an old man's grip. And he walked back across the darkening grass to his aides, and I stood there understanding that I had just been given something rarer than a medal, which is a senior officer who wanted nothing from me at all, except that I be free. The garden emptied as the evening came down and the shadows stretched out across the grass. Neve Larkin, who had served on that team with me, who had sat in the same compounds and drunk the same tea, and who had driven 3 hours that morning to stand at the very back so that I would not have to be alone in front of that wall, found me and squeezed my hand hard and told me she would wait for me by the cars, take all the time I needed. And then, for a few minutes, it was just me and the wall and the last of the light. I put my hand flat on the granite over Rafe Sisto's name, the stone still warm from the day it had spent in the sun, and I told him about the young sergeant who had knocked my cover into the grass. And I will tell you, standing there, I could hear exactly what Rafe would have said about the whole business. I could hear him laughing that easy laugh of his and saying something like, well, Holt, at least he had the decency to be embarrassed about it, and did you make him square your cover away after? I almost laughed myself, out loud, alone in front of that wall with my hand on his name. And I realized it was the first time in 15 years that the wall had felt like a place to go visit a friend instead of a place to stand and be quietly accused by 8 men for the crime of having lived. Behind me, footsteps came soft on the grass. It was Wexler. He came up carefully, the way you approach something you have already broken once, stopping a respectful distance back, and he was holding my cover. When it had gone into the grass that morning, it had picked up a green stain across the brim, ground in, and at some point in that long day, he had quietly taken it away and worked the stain out, cleaned it, brushed the felt, squared the shape of it. He held it out to me now with both hands, the way you hand a folded flag. I couldn't fix the day, ma'am, he said, but I figured I could at least fix your cover. I looked at that young man for a moment in the fading light, and then I reached out and I took it from him. It was a small thing, and it was an exact thing, and the exact things are the only apologies really worth having, because they cost the person something to make. I let him give it to me. You can hold a boundary and offer a bridge in the very same motion with the very same hands. I had spent 15 years believing you had to choose between the two, that dignity meant distance and mercy meant surrender, and I had been wrong about that the way I had been wrong about a great many things I only learned the truth of in that garden. Wexler stood there a moment after I took the cover, not sure if he was dismissed, and I told him one last thing before he went. I told him that in 20 years, when he was the gunnery sergeant briefing some young detail before a big ceremony, I wanted him to tell them this story, and to leave his own name in it, all of it, the shove and the grass and the general and the cover he cleaned, not to punish himself with it, to teach with it. A lesson a man tells on himself is the only kind that ever really lands on the young, because they can see it cost him something to say. He looked at me for a long second, and then he nodded, and I could see him filing it away somewhere permanent. That is how you turn the worst 30 seconds of a young man's life into 30 years of better Marines. You do not bury it, you put it to work. On the drive home that night, in the dark, with the uniform back on its hanger, swaying gently in the back seat, and the small blue ribbon catching the dashboard light every time a car came the other way, I made a decision. I decided that next year, when they dedicated the second phase of that memorial, I would come in my dress uniform, and I would wear the medal at my throat, and I would stand in the front row where the families could see it. Not for me, never for me, for them, so that every Gold Star mother who came to that garden could see with her own eyes that one of theirs had lived, and that the living had not been wasted, that it had been spent on other people's sons brought home. The survivor was finally going to stop apologizing for surviving. I have thought a great deal since then about the man who knocked my cover into the grass, and I have come to be strangely, honestly grateful to him, because he taught me something I had needed all of 15 years to learn and could not seem to learn any gentler way. You do not have to make other people small in order to make yourself seen. And just as important, you do not have to make yourself small in order to keep the peace. You only have to stop bending down quietly and hoping that no one notices you are still standing there. So if someone has ever looked straight through you, if you have ever been the quiet one in the corner of the room that the world forgot to look at twice, I want you to hear this from a woman who spent 15 years in that corner on purpose. You are allowed to stand up straight, you are allowed to be seen, and you never, ever have to make yourself smaller to keep a peace that was never yours to pay for in the first place. I spent a long time believing that the quietest person in the room owed it to everyone else to stay small. Standing at that wall taught me otherwise. If you have ever been the person nobody thought to look at twice, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Do you think I was right to ask the general to let that young sergeant keep his career? Have you ever had someone finally see you on a day you least expected it? What would you have done standing in the grass with your cover at your feet? If this story meant something to you, give it a like and subscribe, and thank you for standing here with me while I told it.